In Korea, terrain often dictated outcomes before any engagement occurred. The peninsula's geography consisted of steep mountain ranges running north to south, separated by narrow valleys and limited road networks. This terrain channeled military movement into predictable corridors and made lateral communication between units difficult. Mountains that appeared passable on maps proved treacherous on foot, with slopes too steep for vehicles and trails too narrow for rapid movement. Winter conditions added layers of difficulty that transformed routine operations into tests of endurance. American forces arriving in Korea during 1950 found themselves operating in an environment fundamentally different from the European scenarios for which doctrine and training had been developed. Mountain warfare imposed constraints that affected every aspect of operations. Supply lines stretched across difficult terrain, making resupply uncertain and time-consuming. Communication between units, separated by ridges and peaks, required relay stations and often failed when weather deteriorated. Movement occurred slowly, measured in hours per kilometer rather than the rapid advances possible on flat ground. Defensive positions on high ground offered advantages in observation and fields of fire, but those same positions became isolated outposts when weather closed in or enemy forces interdicted supply routes. Units committed to mountain positions found their options narrowing as terrain and logistics imposed limits that commanders could not overcome through tactical skill or aggressive action. The operation began as a routine advance to secure a series of ridgelines in the central mountains during late autumn 1950. The battalion received orders to move north from its current positions and establish defensive positions on terrain features designated on maps with elevation numbers and grid coordinates. The mission appeared straightforward based on the orders and the maps used for planning. Intelligence indicated enemy forces in the area but suggested they were withdrawing northward. The terrain would be difficult, but the advance was expected to proceed without major opposition. The battalion consisted of approximately 700 men organized into 3 rifle companies and a headquarters company. Supporting elements included a mortar platoon, medical section, and communications team. Heavy equipment remained with the regimental support elements in the rear. The battalion would move on foot, carrying weapons, ammunition, and sufficient supplies for several days of operations. Resupply would come by truck convoy to a forward supply point, then by foot or mule train to positions in the mountains. Movement began during early morning hours under clear skies. The temperature measured near freezing, typical for the season and altitude. Soldiers wore standard uniforms with field jackets carrying loads that averaged approximately 60 pounds, including weapons, ammunition, rations, and personal equipment. The route followed a valley floor initially, then turned upward along trails that wound through forested slopes. Progress slowed as the column climbed, with frequent halts as lead elements navigated difficult sections and allowed the column to close up. By afternoon, the battalion had covered approximately 8 kilometers and climbed nearly 600 meters in elevation. The lead company reached the first objective, a ridgeline that provided observation over the valley to the north. Defensive positions were established along the ridge while the remaining companies moved into positions on adjacent high ground. Digging fighting positions proved difficult in the rocky soil, but soldiers created shallow trenches and reinforced them with stones. As darkness approached, the battalion occupied a line stretching approximately 2 kilometers along connected ridge lines. The first night passed quietly except for the cold. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, and wind along the exposed ridges made conditions more severe. Soldiers rotated between fighting positions and slightly more sheltered areas behind the ridgeline, but true warmth remained unavailable. Small fires were prohibited due to concern about revealing positions. Frostbite became a concern, particularly for soldiers whose cold weather gear was incomplete or inadequate. Morning brought orders to continue the advance. The battalion would move to additional ridge lines further north, extending the defensive line and maintaining observation over likely enemy approach routes. The movement required descending from current positions, crossing a valley, then climbing to new objectives at similar or higher elevations. Supply vehicles were expected to reach a forward point during the day, allowing resupply before the battalion moved to the next positions. The resupply point sat approximately 4 kilometers behind the current positions, accessible by a rough road that wound through the mountains. A convoy of trucks was scheduled to arrive by midday with ammunition, rations, and cold weather gear that had been requested. However, the convoy experienced delays due to road conditions and did not arrive until late afternoon. When it did arrive, the quantities of supplies were less than requested. Cold weather gear remained in short supply throughout the division, and the battalion received only partial issue. Ammunition and rations were adequate for immediate needs but left little reserve. Carrying parties from the companies moved to the supply point to collect materials and transport them back to positions. This required several hours, delaying the planned movement to new objectives. The battalion commander decided to postpone the advance until the following morning rather than attempt movement during darkness over unfamiliar terrain. Units would remain in current positions for another night, then move at first light. During the night, weather deteriorated. Cloud cover moved in, and light snow began falling around midnight. Visibility dropped to near zero. Temperature fell further, approaching 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind increased, creating conditions that made exposure dangerous even for short periods. Soldiers huddled in fighting positions, trying to preserve body heat while maintaining watch. The snow continued through the night, accumulating several inches by dawn. Morning revealed a changed landscape. The mountains were covered in fresh snow that obscured trails and made movement more difficult. Visibility remained limited due to low clouds and continuing light snowfall. The battalion commander consulted with his company commanders about whether to proceed with the planned movement. The decision was made to continue, as orders required occupation of the forward positions and the current location offered no particular advantage for extended operations. Movement through snow-covered mountains proved slower than previous days' advance. Trails disappeared under snow, forcing lead elements to navigate by compass and terrain features. The battalion moved in column, with each company following the one ahead. Frequent halts occurred as soldiers negotiated steep slopes made slippery by snow and ice. Equipment became wet from snow, adding weight and reducing effectiveness of insulation. Several soldiers slipped and fell during the movement, though injuries remained minor. By afternoon, the battalion had covered perhaps half the planned distance. The battalion commander received a radio message from regimental headquarters, indicating that the situation in other sectors had changed. Enemy forces were conducting attacks against other units in the division, and the overall operational picture was uncertain. The battalion was ordered to continue to its objectives and establish positions, then await further instructions. The message concluded with notice that supply convoys might be delayed due to increased enemy activity along the roads. The advance continued into late afternoon before the lead company reached the assigned ridgeline. The position offered good observation northward when visibility permitted, but current conditions limited observation to a few hundred meters. The companies moved into positions along the ridge and began establishing defensive perimeters. Digging remained difficult in frozen ground covered by snow. Positions were shallow and offered limited protection. As darkness approached, the battalion occupied positions that stretched along approximately 3 kilometers of ridgeline at elevations exceeding 1,500 meters. The companies were separated by terrain features that prevented direct visual contact between units. Communication relied on radio, which functioned intermittently in the mountainous terrain. Wire communication was not established due to the distances involved and limited personnel available for laying wire. Each company operated with some degree of independence, though all remained under battalion control through radio when conditions permitted. The temperature that night fell to approximately 10 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Wind along the exposed ridgeline created effective temperatures far lower. Soldiers faced the choice between remaining in shallow fighting positions exposed to wind or moving to more sheltered positions that offered less observation and fields of fire. Most remained in fighting positions, knowing that enemy forces might approach under cover of darkness and weather. During the early morning hours, listening posts forward of the main positions reported sounds of movement in the valleys below. The reports were fragmentary and uncertain due to wind and limited visibility, but they suggested that forces were moving in the area. The battalion commander reported this information to regiment and requested clarification of the overall situation. The response indicated that enemy forces were active throughout the sector, and that the battalion should maintain its positions and report any contact. Dawn brought no improvement in visibility. Snow continued falling, and clouds remained low over the mountains. Temperature stayed below 0. The battalion had been in position for approximately 18 hours without resupply. Rations were adequate for another day, but ammunition reserves were limited after the incomplete resupply 2 days earlier. Water was obtained by melting snow, a process that consumed time and fuel from the limited supplies available. Around mid-morning, one of the companies reported contact with enemy forces approaching from the north. The engagement was brief, with Chinese troops withdrawing after encountering defensive fire. The company reported no casualties but expended significant ammunition during the engagement. The battalion commander requested resupply and asked for information about when convoys might reach the forward supply point. The response indicated that road conditions and enemy activity had prevented convoys from moving forward. No estimate was provided for when resupply might occur. During the afternoon, additional probing attacks occurred against different portions of the battalion perimeter. These engagements followed similar patterns, with enemy forces approaching positions, engaging briefly, then withdrawing. The attacks appeared designed to test defenses and identify weak points, rather than to overrun positions. American forces held their positions and returned fire, but the cumulative ammunition expenditure reduced available supplies. The battalion commander faced a developing situation where his unit occupied positions that were difficult to defend, low on supplies, and apparently facing enemy forces of unknown size. Communication with regiment remained intermittent due to weather and terrain. The last radio contact indicated that the overall situation remained unclear and that the battalion should hold its current positions. No mention was made of withdrawal or reinforcement. As the second night in the forward positions approached, soldiers had been exposed to extreme cold for extended periods. Cases of frostbite increased, with the battalion aid station treating dozens of soldiers for cold injuries. Some cases were severe enough to require evacuation, but evacuation was not possible given the weather and tactical situation. The aid station could provide only minimal treatment under field conditions. Food supplies dwindled as soldiers consumed rations without resupply. Hunger combined with cold to reduce physical capability and morale. Soldiers became lethargic, moving slowly and showing reduced alertness. Officers and non-commissioned officers worked to keep men active and maintain defensive readiness, but the cumulative effects of cold, hunger, and fatigue affected everyone in the battalion. During the night, enemy forces conducted a more sustained attack against one company position. The engagement lasted approximately 2 hours, with Chinese troops attempting to penetrate the defensive perimeter at several points. American forces held their positions, using rifle fire and grenades to repel the attacks. Mortar support was limited because crews had difficulty operating weapons in extreme cold and because ammunition was being conserved. The attack eventually subsided, but the company reported several casualties and significant ammunition expenditure. Morning revealed that the tactical situation had worsened. The company that had sustained the night attack reported that its ammunition was nearly exhausted. Other companies were in better condition, but still operating with limited supplies. Radio contact with regiment finally succeeded after several hours of attempts, and the battalion commander reported the situation. The response indicated that enemy forces had cut the road network behind the battalion, making resupply impossible for the immediate future. The battalion was ordered to hold its positions and defend against attacks, while higher headquarters worked to restore supply lines and clarify the overall operational picture. The realization developed gradually that the battalion was effectively isolated. The roads that had brought supplies forward were now interdicted. The terrain prevented cross-country movement of supplies in meaningful quantities. Relief forces could not reach the position while enemy forces controlled the approaches. Withdrawal would require abandoning positions, moving through difficult terrain while potentially under attack, and attempting to reach friendly lines whose current locations were uncertain. The options had narrowed to holding the current positions with whatever resources remained available. Commanders at company level understood the situation and worked to prepare their units for extended operations without resupply. Ammunition was redistributed to ensure all positions had some capability to defend. Rations were inventoried and consumption reduced to extend supplies. Water collection from snow became a constant activity. Medical supplies were conserved, with treatment limited to serious injuries. The focus shifted from offensive operations or maneuver to simple endurance and defense of current positions. The third day in position brought no significant change in weather. Snow continued intermittently and temperatures remained well below freezing. Visibility varied, but never exceeded a few hundred meters. Enemy forces conducted periodic probing attacks, but did not launch sustained assaults. The battalion defended its positions, carefully managing ammunition and attempting to maintain defensive readiness despite deteriorating physical condition of soldiers. Communication with higher headquarters remained difficult. Radio contact occurred sporadically, with messages often garbled by atmospheric conditions and terrain interference. The information received indicated that Efforts were underway to restore supply routes and relieve the battalion, but no timeline was provided. The battalion commander focused on immediate challenges of maintaining the defense and keeping soldiers functional under extreme conditions. Frostbite casualties continued accumulating. By the fourth day in position, nearly 1/4 of the battalion had suffered some degree of cold injury. Severe cases could not be treated adequately under field conditions, and those soldiers gradually lost function in affected extremities. The battalion aid station established a collection point for serious casualties, but evacuation remained impossible. Soldiers with lesser injuries remained in positions, though their combat effectiveness was reduced. Food became critically short. Rations ran out completely on the fourth day, leaving soldiers without organized meals. Some emergency rations remained, and these were distributed, but quantities were minimal. Hunger affected everyone, reducing physical strength and mental alertness. Combined with cold and fatigue, the lack of food created a spiral of declining capability that affected the entire battalion. On the fifth day, ammunition reached critically low levels. Some positions were down to a few rounds per rifle. Machine gun ammunition was nearly exhausted. Mortar rounds had been expended days earlier. The battalion could defend against limited attacks but lacked resources to repel sustained assault. Company commanders reported their situations to the battalion commander, who faced the reality that his unit could not hold indefinitely without resupply. Late on the fifth day, radio contact with regiment brought news that a relief force had broken through the enemy positions blocking the road network. Supplies were being organized and would move forward as soon as routes were secured. The battalion was ordered to continue holding its positions until relief arrived. The estimated time for relief was 24 to 48 hours, assuming no further delays. The relief timeline meant the battalion would need to endure at least one more full day and possibly two in current conditions. Commanders assessed whether this was possible given the state of troops and remaining supplies. The conclusion was that the battalion could maintain defensive positions, but had no reserve capability. Any serious attack would likely overwhelm defenses simply through ammunition exhaustion rather than tactical failure. The sixth night passed without major contact. Enemy forces conducted limited probing but did not press attacks. Whether this reflected enemy caution, supply difficulties on their part, or some other factor remained unknown. American forces maintained positions, rotating men through fighting positions and shelter areas, though the distinction between the two offered little actual difference in protection from cold. Dawn on the seventh day brought improved weather, cloud cover lifted, and visibility increased to several kilometers. The temperature remained below freezing but moderated slightly from the extreme lows of previous days. With improved visibility, observation posts could see movement in valleys to the north where enemy forces appeared to be repositioning. This movement suggested possible preparation for attack, though intentions remained unclear. Around midday, the sound of vehicle engines reached the battalion positions from the south. Radio contact confirmed that supply trucks had reached the forward supply point and were being unloaded. Carrying parties organized quickly to move to the supply point and return with materials. The movement required several hours through snow-covered terrain, but the prospect of resupply motivated soldiers despite their exhausted condition. The supplies that arrived included ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and some cold weather gear. Quantities were limited by what vehicles could carry and what men could transport on foot back to positions. The resupply provided enough to restore minimal defensive capability and feed soldiers, though not enough to fully replenish all shortages. Medical supplies allowed proper treatment of frostbite casualties and other injuries that had been accumulating. With resupply accomplished, the battalion commander received orders that the unit would be relieved in position by a fresh battalion moving up from reserve. The relief would occur over 2 days, with companies being replaced sequentially to maintain defensive coverage. Once relieved, the battalion would withdraw to rear areas for rest and refit. The casualties from cold and combat, combined with the physical toll on all personnel, meant the battalion required substantial recovery time before returning to operations. The relief process began the following morning. Fresh troops moved into positions while the companies that had held the ridgeline for 7 days withdrew. The movement back occurred slowly, with many soldiers requiring assistance due to frostbite and exhaustion. Vehicles waited at the supply point to transport personnel to the rear. The evacuation took most of the day as companies moved out of the mountains, By evening, the battalion had withdrawn completely from the forward positions. Casualty figures showed approximately 40 soldiers wounded in combat engagements and over 150 suffering frostbite or other cold weather injuries. Several soldiers had died from wounds or exposure during the week in position. Equipment losses included weapons damaged by cold, radios that had failed, and personal gear worn out or lost during operations. The battalion required weeks to replace personnel, repair equipment, and restore combat capability. The operation achieved its limited objective of holding terrain features for the period required by higher headquarters. The cost included casualties, equipment losses, and the physical toll on every soldier involved. There was no victory to claim, only survival of a situation where terrain, weather, and enemy action had combined to create circumstances offering no good options. The battalion had endured because withdrawal was not possible, and relief took time to arrive. The experience was one of thousands similar instances during the Korean War where units held positions because orders required it and because the alternative was worse. In the mountains of Korea, terrain dictated outcomes, and sometimes the outcome was simply lasting until conditions changed enough to permit survival. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe.